The ranch sat on the edge of a quiet Texas town, far enough from the highways that nights were filled with the sound of crickets and coyotes instead of engines and horns. It stretched wide, with fences running like veins across the dry earth, dotted with cattle that grazed under the heavy sun. For years, it had been a symbol of hard work and pride, passed down through families who fought to keep their land. On the surface, nothing about it stood out, just another piece of American soil. But underneath the quiet, cracks were forming, the kind that no one noticed until it was too late. The man who owned it wasn't there. He was serving overseas, wearing his uniform and carrying the weight of a nation that expected him to be loyal no matter what it cost him. Back home, his ranch was supposed to be safe, protected by the same values he was fighting for. He had trusted the neighborhood association to keep order while he was gone, to handle the boring things, fees, community rules, the details no soldier wants to think about when he's thousands of miles away. He never imagined the very people who were meant to guard the peace would be the ones to steal it from him. The HOA wasn't a group of neighbors simply looking out for each other. It was a machine built on small rules and quiet threats, where a missed payment or a disagreement could quickly turn into something bigger. On paper, it was about lawns and fences, about keeping the neighborhood clean. In reality, it was about control. The board members knew their power, and they knew how to use it. Behind their smiles at block parties and their nods in church pews, there was a hunger to remind others who was in charge. The soldier's absence gave them an opening. He had been gone for months, the dust on his porch telling the story of a house left waiting for its owner, letters stacked in his mailbox, notices taped to his door. What had started as small reminders turned into warnings. The board didn't care that he was across the world, that his life was tied to duty and danger. To them, he was just another man not following the rules. Life in the neighborhood moved on around his empty home. Children played in the streets, couples tended their gardens, and barbecues filled the summer air with smoke. But whenever someone passed his property, there was a different kind of silence. Some wondered why the board was so eager, why the whispers about selling the ranch grew louder even though everyone knew where its owner was. Others stayed quiet, afraid to question the people who had the power to make life miserable for anyone who crossed them. The HOA president, a man with a polished smile and eyes that never softened, carried himself like the ranch already belonged to him. He dressed in pressed shirts and carried binders to every meeting, speaking in clipped sentences that made people nervous to interrupt. To outsiders, he was the picture of order and leadership. To those who lived under his rules, he was the kind of man who could take something small, a lawn left unmowed, a late fee unpaid, and turn it into a punishment that lingered for months. What no one said out loud, but everyone felt, was the difference in skin color. The soldier was a black man in a neighborhood that had never truly welcomed him. They smiled at his face, some even shook his hand, but when decisions were made behind closed doors, his name always carried a different weight. He was respected as a serviceman, yes, but respected in the way you respect someone useful, not someone you see as an equal. And when he left for deployment, the mask of politeness slipped. The story of the ranch wasn't just about missed payments or paperwork. It was about something older, something rooted in the land itself. Land had always been power in America, and power had never been shared equally. To own acres, to raise cattle, to stand on soil that your hands had worked for. That was independence. To strip someone of that, especially when they couldn't fight back, was more than theft. It was erasure. The soldier's family tried to keep things together in his absence. His wife made calls, wrote letters, and tried to explain that her husband was overseas and couldn't answer their notices. But the board acted as though her words meant nothing. Each call was another reminder of how powerless she was against people who had already decided the outcome. Neighbors heard the stress in her voice, the way her tone cracked when she asked for help. Most looked away. Pretending it wasn't their fight. The house itself began to change, almost as if it knew what was coming. The grass grew wild, creeping high around the fence posts. The windows grew dusty and the porch sagged with neglect. Where once it had looked like a home, now it looked like a property, something to be claimed. Strangers driving by wouldn't have known the difference, wouldn't have seen the life that had been lived inside those walls. But for those who did know, it was like watching a slow death. The tension in the air was hard to name but impossible to ignore. The soldier's absence was not just physical. It created a silence that was filled by whispers, judgments, and plans made without him. The board's meetings stretched longer, their language sharper. They talked about rules and bylaws, but beneath it all was the quiet certainty that they could take what they wanted. For the soldier, thousands of miles away, the ranch was more than land. It was his promise of a future, his anchor in a world where everything else could be taken by war. He had pictured coming home to it, walking the fields, feeling the same soil beneath his boots that had carried generations before him. What he didn't know was that while he was fighting battles abroad, another war had been declared against him at home. One fought with papers, signatures, and a greed that wore the mask of authority. And as the last of the summer sun dipped low over the neighborhood, the ranch stood like a shadow, waiting for the blow that would finally bring it down. The crime had not yet been carried out, but the pieces were already moving into place. Those who saw it happening kept their silence, some out of fear, others out of quiet agreement. And the soldier, far from home, had no idea that the life he was fighting to protect was already slipping away. The first cracks in the story showed themselves in whispers, then in small but deliberate actions that could almost be brushed off as coincidences. The soldier's wife had called the HOA office again, her voice heavy with exhaustion. She had begged them to understand, to give her time until her husband returned from deployment. She explained that the fees had been mailed late because of their financial strain. Deployment pay had its own delays, and she was stretched thin, raising 2 children while carrying the weight of a household alone. The HOA president listened in silence before calmly reminding her that rules were rules. His tone was smooth, too smooth, the kind that never broke into empathy. When she hung up, she realized with a chill that her words hadn't mattered at all. The board began to move with intent. Notices that should have gone through regular channels suddenly came faster, each one written in harsher language. Neighbors started noticing the bright orange slips taped to the family's door, marks of shame that drew attention. Some stopped by to ask questions, their faces tight with curiosity and a hint of pity. Others said nothing, content to let the soldier's absence speak for itself. The HOA's language shifted from reminders to warnings, and warnings to threats. Soon the talk wasn't about overdue fees anymore. It was about foreclosure. What ate at the soldier's wife most was how quickly the process was moving. She remembered other families in the neighborhood who had missed payments, who had left their lawns unmowed, who had stacked junk by their garages for months without consequence. They had been given patience, gentle nudges, and time. But when it came to her family, the rules were followed to the letter, even tightened. She couldn't help but see what was underneath it all. Their difference. Their presence in a community that had never really welcomed them. The pressure wasn't just financial. It was racial, social, and deeply personal. Behind the HOA's polished meeting minutes and stiff paperwork was the president himself. He had always viewed the soldier with a quiet resentment. The man wore his uniform with pride, neighbors often thanking him for his service, their voices dripping with admiration. The president, who had never served, had felt a subtle sting in those moments, as though the soldier's existence cast a shadow over his own. That jealousy festered. It wasn't about missed payments anymore. It was about reminding the neighborhood who really held the power. The board members weren't blind to his motives, but most of them went along. Some had their own grievances, old slights that had been carried for years. One remembered the soldier correcting him in public over a zoning rule. Another felt slighted when the soldier's wife declined to join the women's club, too busy with her children. Petty things, small things, but in tight-knit neighborhoods, small things fester into bitterness. The president only had to fan those flames, and soon the board was united in treating the soldier's absence as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. Outside pressures made everything sharper. The soldier's wife had to juggle bills, the car loan, school supplies for the children, and groceries that always seemed more expensive. Each envelope that came from the HOA felt like a knife twisting deeper, and her calls to her husband overseas grew harder to manage. She wanted to shield him from the stress, but he could hear it in her voice. The tension between them was subtle, but it grew. He felt helpless, trapped in a world where he could not defend his own home. She felt abandoned, carrying a weight too heavy for her shoulders. Neighbors noticed. Some sympathized quietly, offering kind words but no real help. Others whispered behind closed doors, treating the family's struggles like gossip. One man, who had long wanted to buy land for his own cattle, saw the situation as a chance. He began showing up to HOA meetings more often, nodding along with the president's sharp words, his eyes lingering on the ranch's address whenever it was mentioned. A hidden agenda started forming in the shadows, one that had nothing to do with community rules and everything to do with profit. The soldiers' children, too young to understand the politics, could still feel the tension in their home. They saw their mother crying late at night, heard the sharp tone in her voice when she hung up the phone. Their house, once filled with laughter and stories of their father's bravery, now felt heavy. Even their friends at school repeated things they overheard from their parents, little remarks about their family not fitting in, or about how the ranch would be better taken care of by someone else. The cruelty of adults trickled down, shaping the way children treated each other. As weeks passed, the house began to look more abandoned. The family tried to keep up, but the pressure was suffocating. The grass grew higher, the paint peeled a little more, the porch sagged. Each sign of neglect became another weapon for the HOA. They documented everything. Photos, reports, official letters. It was as if they were building a case in a courtroom, but the trial was one-sided. The soldier was not present to defend himself, and his wife's words fell on ears that had already chosen not to hear. The president began holding private conversations with certain board members, speaking in low tones after meetings ended. Words like auction and liens slipped into their dialogue, carrying with them the scent of finality. The possibility of selling the ranch was no longer distant. It was real, and it was near. Every step they took made it harder for the soldier's family to fight back. Each day brought them closer to a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. Inside the soldier himself, the conflict grew unbearable. Calls from home were filled with silence, long pauses where neither he nor his wife knew what to say. He couldn't leave, couldn't abandon his duty, but every fiber in his body screamed to return, to fight for the land that was his. The military expected his loyalty, demanded his time, but the cost was his family's security. He was a man split in two, one half in uniform, the other half screaming in silence as his life unraveled without him. The darker side of the HOA began to reveal itself more openly. At one meeting, when a neighbor timidly suggested leniency, the president cut him off with a sharp reminder that rules apply to everyone. His words were met with nods, but not all of them were sincere. A few residents left with heavy hearts, realizing the cruelty in the process, but unwilling to stand against it. Fear of retaliation kept them quiet. Everyone had heard stories of neighbors who resisted, only to find themselves drowning in fines and lawsuits until they gave up. Meanwhile, the man with the hidden agenda grew bolder. He began quietly reaching out to real estate contacts, testing the waters. If the ranch went to auction, he wanted to be the first in line. His greed grew alongside the board's cruelty, each feeding the other. For him, the soldier's absence wasn't a tragedy. It was a business opportunity. As the days bled into weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People no longer looked at the soldier's house as a home. They looked at it as property, as land, as a prize waiting to be claimed. The children playing nearby stopped venturing too close, their parents warning them away from what was now whispered about as that house. The wife stopped attending gatherings, her isolation becoming complete. She felt like an outcast in the very place her family had fought so hard to belong. What once had been an ordinary suburban community had turned into a stage for quiet warfare. Power, jealousy, greed and prejudice were no longer hidden. They simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to erupt. Each action taken by the HOA was a step toward a breaking point. The soldier's family was being backed into a corner, their voices drowned by authority, their future slipping into the hands of people who never truly wanted them there. And as fall crept closer, the shadows over the ranch grew darker. Every letter, every whispered conversation, every glance between neighbors carried with it the weight of what was coming. It wasn't a question of if the crime would happen, it was only a matter of when. The day it happened was painfully ordinary, which made it all the more cruel. The sun was bright, the air dry, the streets quiet except for the hum of sprinklers hitting pavement. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. But inside the HOA office, papers were stacked in neat piles, stamped and signed, every line of fine print ready to carry out the final blow. What was about to unfold wouldn't come with sirens or shattered glass. It would come with signatures, gavels, and the cold efficiency of a system designed to strip a man of his home without a single raised voice. The soldier's wife hadn't been warned that this would be the day. She had begged for more time, begged for a meeting. But when she opened her door that morning, she found a notice pinned to it like a scar. Property foreclosed. The words blurred before her eyes as she read them, her hands shaking so badly she could hardly hold the paper. She had known it was coming. Every sign had pointed here. But the finality still hit her like a punch to the chest. She ran inside, pulling her children close as though the walls around them might crumble at any moment. Her voice cracked as she left a frantic voicemail for her husband, knowing he might not even hear it for days. She tried calling the HOA office, but no one picked up. When she drove down to the meeting hall, she found the parking lot already filled with cars, the sound of murmurs leaking from the open windows. Inside, the air was thick. The board sat at the front of the room, papers spread out before them, their faces set in expressions of false calm. The HOA president spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His voice carried across the room as he read out the motion to finalize the foreclosure. To him it wasn't a crime. It was business, rules, the system working as it should. To the wife, standing at the back of the room with her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear, it was theft in broad daylight. She tried to speak, her words trembling as she pleaded with them to stop. She told them her husband was serving overseas, that the family had been struggling, that this ranch was everything they had. But her voice was drowned out by the shuffle of papers, the clearing of throats, the polite nods of agreement as the board voted one by one. Each yes struck her like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of her family's life. By the time the final vote was cast, she felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. The moment the gavel struck, the crime was done. It was not loud, not bloody, not violent in the way people imagine crimes to be, but it was no less brutal. A man who had given his life to his country was stripped of his land in his absence, betrayed not by strangers in some foreign place, but by the very community he had trusted to watch over his home. The wife's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank into a chair at the back of the room, clutching her children as tears blurred her vision. Around her, the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some refusing to meet her gaze. A few looked away in shame, but not one of them stood up to stop what had just happened. Silence was their cover, their shield, their complicity. The HOA president felt a flicker of something, whether guilt or triumph, even he wasn't sure, but it passed quickly, buried beneath the pride of victory. He justified it to himself with the same cold logic he had rehearsed for weeks. Rules were rules. Payments were missed. Property standards had slipped. It wasn't about race. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about greed. It was about order. At least, that was the lie he told himself to sleep at night. In truth, he felt a rush of power as he watched the wife crumble. To him, it was proof of his authority, of his ability to bend the community to his will. For the other board members, the emotions fizzed, airied. One looked down at his hands, shame rising in his chest as he remembered the soldier correcting him years ago. Another thought about the ranch itself, picturing its wide fields and calculating its worth. Still, another reminded herself that she had no choice but to go along. Standing against the president would have meant putting her own property at risk. The immediate aftermath was chaos in silence. The wife stormed out of the hall, her children trailing behind her, their eyes wide with fear. Neighbors stood in small groups, whispering, some shaking their heads, others shrugging it off as something inevitable. The man who had been eyeing the ranch for months slipped out early, pulling out his phone to make calls, already preparing his bid. Back overseas, the soldier finally received his wife's voicemail hours later. He listened in stunned silence as her voice broke, the words spilling out in gasps. "They sold it. They took the ranch. Please, I don't know what to do." His hands trembled as he held the phone, his chest tightening with a rage that words could not contain. Around him, the war zone felt suddenly distant, muted, as if the real battle was happening thousands of miles away, in a small Texas town where his life had just been stolen. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. The soldier's wife paced their empty house that night, the notice still crumpled in her hand. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a countdown, every shadow like an omen of what was to come. Her children clung to her, asking questions she couldn't answer. How do you explain to children that their home has been taken not by strangers, but by the very people they wave to every morning? For the HOA president, the night was one of restless triumph. He sat alone in his tidy living room, sipping a glass of whiskey, staring out the window at the darkened streets. He told himself it was done, finished, clean. Yet, in the quiet moments between sips, he felt a gnawing unease. The soldier would come home eventually, and when he did, there would be consequences. The community itself was shaken, though no one would say it aloud. Some felt relief that it wasn't them. Others carried guilt, like a stone in their chest. A few justified it, repeating the president's words about rules and fairness until they half believed them. But deep down, every single one of them knew they had witnessed something that would not stay buried. The land was too sacred, the betrayal too deep, the injustice too raw. The crime wasn't just the foreclosure, it was the stripping of dignity, the breaking of trust, the public humiliation of a family left defenseless. And though the night ended quietly, with locked doors and darkened houses, an invisible line had been crossed. The soldier's ranch was no longer his, and yet it would never truly belong to anyone else. It had been stolen, and the stain of that theft would seep into the soil itself, waiting for the day when the true price would be paid. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Within days of the foreclosure, whispers in the neighborhood turned into phone calls across town, and soon local newspapers picked up the story. A black soldier serving overseas had lost his ranch because of unpaid HOA dues. The headlines carried an air of disbelief, almost as though the crime was too cruel to be real. Photos of the soldier in uniform appeared next to images of the house, and the contrast was devastating. A man risking his life for his country had been stripped of his home while he was away, his family left broken in his absence. The HO, a board scrambled to control the narrative. The president issued a statement filled with rehearsed language about community standards, and uniform enforcement of rules. He insisted there was nothing personal, nothing discriminatory, only a matter of procedure. But the more he spoke, the colder his words sounded. Neighbors who once nodded along with him began to feel uneasy. They saw their names in the minutes of meetings, their votes recorded, their silence immortalized. It was harder to dismiss when the world outside their neighborhood began to look in. The wife found herself at the center of attention, which she never asked for. Reporters knocked on her door, cameras lingered at the curb, and strangers left letters of support in her mailbox. She wanted none of it. She wanted her home back, her husband back, her children to stop asking if they had to move. She carried a weight no apology could lift. Nights were sleepless, her mind cycling through guilt and rage, replaying the moment she stood in that meeting hall, powerless to stop what was already decided. The soldier, thousands of miles away, was consumed by fury. The army tried to keep him focused, but his anger was impossible to contain. His fellow servicemen noticed the change in him. The shorter temper, the long silences, the way his jaw clenched when he read messages from home. He wasn't just fighting an enemy abroad anymore. He was fighting a betrayal he could do nothing about. Each day felt like a punishment. His uniform suddenly heavier, his service twisted into a cruel irony. The community itself fractured. Some neighbors defended the HOA, insisting the rules were clear and the soldier had failed to follow them. They clung to the idea that order justified cruelty, that legality excused morality. Others were sickened by what they had witnessed. A few tried to apologize quietly to the wife, offering words they should have spoken months earlier, but their apologies only deepened her grief. Where were they when she needed them most? Why was their courage found only after the damage was done? The HOA president carried himself as if untouched, but inside cracks were forming. His confidence, once so sharp, began to dull under the weight of public backlash. He received anonymous letters, some accusing him of racism, others calling him a thief. His phone rang late into the night with reporters demanding answers he didn't want to give. At home, his wife avoided his eyes, ashamed of the role he played. He told himself he was right, that rules were rules, but the words sounded emptier each time he repeated them. For the soldiers' children, the aftermath was confusing and cruel. Their classmates whispered about the foreclosure, some repeating their parents' harsh judgments. They felt the sting of exclusion at school, the weight of being different in a community that now saw their family as a controversy. Nights were filled with questions their mother couldn't answer. Why did the board hate them? Why did no one help? When would their father come home and make it right? Their innocence was chipped away piece by piece, replaced with a quiet bitterness far too heavy for children to carry. The broader public's reaction was fierce. Veterans groups rallied around the soldier, condemning the HOA and demanding justice. Social media amplified the outrage, with thousands sharing his story, calling for new laws to protect servicemen and their families from predatory actions back home. What had begun as a local dispute exploded into a national conversation about race, power, and the unchecked authority of homeowner associations. For the HOA board, reputations collapsed overnight. Men and women who once strutted through community events with pride now avoided eye contact, their names linked forever to the crime. Some resigned quietly, unable to face the pressure. Others doubled down, insisting the world had misunderstood. But the stain would never wash out. Their lives had been defined by a single choice, a single vote, and no amount of justification could erase it. The wife, though crushed, found small strength in the support pouring in from outside the neighborhood. Strangers sent money to help her fight the case. Lawyers offered pro bono services, and activists promised to shine a light on the injustice. But she remained guarded, unwilling to trust easily again. Trust had been her undoing. Trust in the board, in her neighbors, in the idea that service and sacrifice meant protection. That illusion had been shattered, and in its place grew a hardened resolve. The soldier, when he finally returned home months later, stood on the soil of a ranch that no longer belonged to him. He walked the fields, touched the fences, breathed in the air as though trying to memorize what had been taken. Anger burned in his chest, but beneath it was grief so deep it threatened to drown him. He had fought battles abroad, but nothing compared to this wound, inflicted not by enemies, but by his own community. The crime rippled outward, leaving scars on everyone it touched. The neighbors carried guilt, the board carried shame, the family carried loss. The town itself would never live it down, remembered not for its quiet streets and tidy lawns, but for the day it betrayed one of its own. The soldier and his family became symbols of resilience. Their or a warning of what happens when power is left unchecked and compassion is absent. And though time moved forward, the weight of the crime lingered like a shadow over every home in that neighborhood. No one could pass the ranch without feeling it. No one could look at the board without remembering. It was a crime committed with papers and signatures, but its damage was carved deep into human hearts, where no gavel could erase it. The final chapter of this story leaves us with a haunting mixture of resolution and unease. On the surface, the legal system did its work. Those responsible for the crime faced trials, arguments were laid before the court, and verdicts were handed down. To some, these outcomes felt like justice, a closing of a dark chapter in which the guilty were forced to confront the weight of their actions. Yet for others, justice seemed incomplete, more a performance than a restoration. No sentence, no matter how severe, could undo the loss or fully compensate for the devastation inflicted. The crime had fractured lives, and even as the gavel struck, those fractures remained jagged and unhealed. The personal consequences were even more far-reaching than the legal ones. For the perpetrators, the confines of prison, or the looming shadow of public disgrace, became their new reality, stripping them of identity, freedom, and dignity. Yet even this punishment carried a strange irony. Some clung to denial, others to justification, while a few seemed to realize too late the enormity of what they had done. For the victims' families, no verdict or punishment could restore what had been lost. They lived daily with an irreplaceable absence, a wound that bled quietly in the corners of their lives. Friends and neighbors, too, carried scars. Some withdrew into silence, struggling to comprehend how ordinary lives around them had spiraled into tragedy. Others became activists, determined that such darkness should never touch another community in the same way. The question of whether lives were irrevocably changed hardly needs asking. The evidence is everywhere. The families are not the same. The perpetrators are not the same. Even the bystanders who witnessed the slow unraveling of events carry shadows they will never shake. If closure is meant to bring peace, then this case offers something different. The law may have written its final line, but closure for the soul is far harder to come by. For many, justice was not an answer, but simply another chapter in a story of loss. The societal impact of the crime rippled outward like concentric circles on still water. Communities that once felt safe and predictable suddenly found themselves questioning every assumption. How could something like this happen here? Could anyone truly know the people they called neighbors, co-workers, or friends? The shock gave way to suspicion to fear, and fear to long conversations about the fragility of trust. In living rooms, in workplaces, and in classrooms, the case became a reference point, a story retold in hushed voices, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as gossip, always as a reminder that darkness can creep into even the most familiar spaces. The role of the media cannot be ignored in shaping these perceptions. Sensational headlines, lurid details, and endless speculation turned the crime into both a spectacle and a cautionary tale. For some, this constant coverage felt like a second violation, reducing tragedy into entertainment. For others, the media's attention gave voice to pain that might otherwise have been buried. The accused were turned into symbols, the victims into martyrs, and the public into jury members sitting in judgment. Over time, the case became shorthand in conversations about morality, law, and human weakness. Its details may fade, but its name, like so many notorious crimes before it, will linger in memory. As a cultural marker, institutions too felt the aftershocks. Politicians spoke of reform, lawyers debated loopholes, and community leaders called for greater protections. While some of these efforts were more symbolic than substantive, they reflected the deep unease the case had unearthed. In neighborhoods and organizations touched by the crime, support groups emerged, vigils were held, and preventative programs were discussed. The crime had not only destroyed lives, it had also revealed cracks in systems meant to protect them. Whether those cracks would be repaired or ignored became yet another legacy of the tragedy. At the heart of reflection lies morality, and this case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. Jealousy, obsession, and manipulation, emotions and behaviors that exist quietly in everyday life, were here amplified until they destroyed. What does it mean that such ordinary feelings can give way to such extraordinary violence? The fragility of human relationships, once exposed, seemed almost unbearable. Trust, which binds families, friendships, and communities, has shown itself vulnerable to betrayal, control, and unchecked desire. The story becomes not only about crime, but about the thin, fragile lines between love and control, between devotion and destruction. Power dynamics also played a decisive role in the tragedy. Whether in the form of financial control, emotional manipulation, or societal expectation, power was wielded in ways that suffocated rather than nurtured. The crime revealed how deeply inequality of money, of gender, of status can distort human relationships. At its most basic level, it was not only about one violent act, but about a chain of pressures that created a climate where violence felt to some inevitable. Human motivation, as this case shows, is never simple. Rarely do people act from pure malice or pure innocence. Instead, actes sentiet. Ons are born from a mix of fear, insecurity, love, desperation, and pride. Understanding the crime requires acknowledging this complexity, even when doing so is deeply uncomfortable. To paint the story in black and white would be to miss its unsettling lessons. The grayness of human behavior, its contradictions and layers, forces us to reconsider how we judge others, and perhaps even ourselves. In the broader view, the case becomes a lens through which to examine society itself. Justice, though delivered in the courts, raises more questions than it answers. Can punishment ever restore balance when the loss is permanent? Is redemption possible for those who have caused irreparable harm? These questions linger beyond the prison walls and courtroom doors, echoing into conversations about morality and human behavior. They remind us that justice is not only about verdicts, but about healing, accountability, and the willingness to learn from darkness. The ripple effects of violence extend further than anyone imagines. Families fracture, communities lose their sense of safety, and entire generations can inherit trauma from acts they did not personally witness. The case reminds us that violence is never isolated. It spreads, infects, and reshapes, leaving marks that can last decades. In this sense, the crime was not only a personal tragedy, but a generational one, reshaping how people think, behave, and trust. The lessons extend even deeper into societal norms. Silence, denial, and the ignoring of red flags allowed tensions to escalate unchecked. If anything, the case demonstrates the urgent need to speak, to intervene, and to question before it is too late. The tragedy is a mirror, showing us not only the failures of individuals, but also the blind spots of entire communities. It asks us to reconsider what we accept, what we overlook, and what responsibilities we share. As the narrative closes, one truth becomes clear. This was never simply a crime story. It was, and remains, a human story. Behind the headlines, the trials, and the debates are broken families, shattered lives, and lingering grief. To reduce it to statistics or sensational details would be to forget the humanity at its core. At the end of it all, we are reminded that empathy must guide how we understand such tragedies, not as abstract tales of right and wrong, but as deeply human failures. The larger message that emerges is one of caution and reflection. Power, morality, and human frailty intertwine in ways that can uplift or destroy. Justice is necessary but never sufficient. And while laws can punish, only society itself can learn from the past and work toward preventing such darkness from taking root again. In the quiet after the storm, we are left to ask not only what happened, but what it reveals about us all. This story, then, closes not with satisfaction, but with contemplation. It is a reminder of how thin the margins are between stability and collapse, between love and destruction, between justice and futility. It reminds us of the enduring struggle of humanity to balance morality with desire, power with empathy, and justice with forgiveness. Perhaps that is the truest resolution we can find. Not a neat ending, but a recognition of the fragile, complicated nature of being human.